My name is Professor Joseph Siracusa. I am from the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology University in Melbourne. I have been in Australia since 1973. Before that, I was a stockbroker in New York. I worked with Don Regan, who went on to become Secretary of the Treasury. And before that, I studied at the University of Colorado and the University of Vienna, where I was a student between 1964 and 1965, where I got an opportunity to visit Prague on a number of occasions when you were a good communist country. Rethinking the future is really another way of asking, do you know where you've been? Because the lessons of history are very important, particularly the legacy lections, legacy issues. If you live in Europe, you're living with the consequences of the Cold War, the Second World War, the interwar period, and the First World War. So these things are very, very important. There are many important lessons to learn. And as we all know from the great Spanish philosopher Santayana, those who do not know their history are condemned to repeat it. So I think it's very important. Now, history doesn't always repeat itself exactly. But as the great Mark Twain says, it does rhyme a lot. So that's important to remember too. Oh, absolutely. The lessons of the Cold War, particularly in the area of nuclear proliferation. We had all these wonderful agreements with the Soviet Union on strategic nuclear weapons and anti-ballistic missile systems, and we had all kinds of agreements about air warfare, naval warfare. There are important lessons there to be learned about how to avert conflict in the future. And we also understood during the Cold War that there were certain things you didn't do in the Middle East, and that is you didn't introduce outside forces, because then you couldn't control them. And it's a very complex place. So we have many lessons with all those years of Soviet-American relations. And, the Cold War went on from 1945 to 1991. The only thing we couldn't predict was how it ended, because it ended in a whimper instead of a bang. But there are many important lessons to be learned from the Cold War. And today we have a lot of younger people in institutes and foreign ministries who don't know enough history. And so I think it's very important to understand these things, to understand where you're going, and at least you know we've tried different things before. So I'm a very large proponent of understanding history before you can understand what's going on today. Well, Russia is very ambitious. In 1991, on Christmas Day 1991, the Soviet flag came down. And within a very short period of time, the Soviet Empire collapsed. And while it was collapsing, these independent nations of Eastern and Central Europe went off in their own direction, along with Czechoslovakia and Hungary and others, and Poland. And so the Soviets, or the Russians, had to learn how to live as a single nation. But this is a very large nation with 8 time zones that go all the way to Siberia, and they have to find their place in Europe again. And Vladimir Putin is one of these young KGB officers at the time who believes that, right up to now, and he believes it sincerely, that his job is to make Russia great again. Not on the same level as the Soviet Union, because it doesn't have the Ukraine or those missiles it used to have, but to make it a major player. So he wants people to understand that Russia is a legitimate power, it's a significant power, it's an arbiter of Europe, and he wants to play the game. Now, he also is trying, he's a bit of a revanchist. He wants to sort of pick up some pieces. The Crimea was too important to be left outside the Russian zone, maybe even the Ukraine. He wants the whole of that back. So he's gotten into conflict. And he's a little worried about NATO intentions. Now, if I were Putin, I might have the same worries. At the end of the Cold War, all the new nations of Europe, Eastern and Central Europe, joined, before they joined the EU or right afterwards, either way, they became part of NATO, and that those NATO troops came right up to the Russian border, that is up to Ukraine. And that's when they resisted that. So he's very worried about being encircled by NATO forces, because he's afraid that NATO has plans for him. Now, NATO thinks that he's got plans for NATO. So there's a great deal of misunderstanding about intentions. And we've sanctioned him very severely over Crimea and over Georgia and other places like that. And he can take the sanctions, but he's He has a number of grievances, some which are historically correct. We shouldn't be ganging up on him. Well, you know, we got 29 nations that are anti-Russian in terms of policy. So he worries about that. That's why he just had these big maneuvers with the Chinese in the East. He wants to show the people in Europe that he is a major player. But, you know, he can be handled. We just have to take into account his legitimate aspirations and to reject those that step on other people. You know, I said in my talk, the world's not a mess. It's just a messy place. We're having trouble understanding each other, and some of the grievances are legitimate. And as a historian, I think it's very important to remember that there are two sides to every story. One side might be more compelling than the other, but there are always two sides. So Putin has some legitimate grievances with Europe and with NATO, and NATO and Europe have some grievances with him, particularly his future intentions. So we just have to settle this down and sort of engage him instead of threatening him. And he has to do the same thing. Yes, I was a student in the 60s in Vienna, so I got to go to Prague in the good old days. And Prague always had a different kind of communism. You know, I think at the time they called it communism with a human face. It was always more like socialism. Communism is run by a very tight party with heavy discipline. And the Czechs aren't built that way. In February 1948, when your foreign minister was killed or died, that was the end of the last liberal in the communist-led government. And so, you know, the lights went out there. So Americans knew what happened in 1948. Americans knew that Czechoslovakia had been abandoned at the Munich conference to Hitler. And in 1968, there were a lot of Americans who thought they should have done more for the Czechs, particularly when the Warsaw troops came in, because the Czechs, while they're doing their own things, they're also influenced by Radio Free Europe, so you have a bit of a responsibility. During the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, we did nothing. In 1968, we did nothing. And then, of course, what we learned in 1968 is that the Soviet Union and the United States were not going to go to war over anything in Eastern and Central Europe. The issues were considered settled. And so you had that wonderful, is it Brezhnev doctrine, where Brezhnev says that once a socialist state, always a socialist state. Well, that's a very, very thin rationale for bringing the forces in. Nobody really believed that. So from 1968 until 1989, it was always very clear to me that the Czechoslovakia would find a way to throw off the Soviet yoke. And they did, and they probably, I try to understand the reasons why people broke up in 1993, when Czechs went their own way and the Slovaks went the other way.